Hello, my name is Constant Brand, and welcome to our latest edition of EEA Ask an Expert series here on the EEA Facebook page. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. Joining me today are two of our experts, Lorenzo Benini and Celine Bout, and today we are discussing how can knowledge about change in the future help Europe achieve sustainability. Right behind me here. Yeah, it's quite an interesting subject, a large subject, and lots to discuss. With our experts today and with you, of course, our audience. So if you have any comments or questions you want raised during the discussion, please feel free to post them right here under our live video box in our comment section, and we will make sure our experts see them and get to them to answer them for you today. So welcome to our experts today. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent.
Very well.
Celine, talk with you. What are we talking about in this area? What are you working on specifically in this area? I'll ask both of you, I guess, but if you want to start.
Yes, thank you. Yes, so I'm working on foresight and sustainability. So it's about developing foresight projects that can support sustainability assessments. And so the idea is to explore potential connections between different sectors and trends, and always with the idea of assessing potential impacts on the environment and health.
So when we talk about foresight, we mean future planning.
Yeah, foresight is like it's the discipline. I'm quoting a report from the EU. There is the discipline of exploring, anticipating, and shaping the future. So it helps build and use collective intelligence in a structured and systematic way. So the idea is anticipating potential development. So if we have a topic in particular, we think, for example, urban mobility, and we link it to a more systemic approach to different sectors like social, technology, environment, economy, politics. That's the typical framework. We link that particular topics to these different sectors, and we look at potential connections between those, because everything is interconnected. So it's very often strong connections, and we look towards the time horizon. So we look at potential developments and what these implications would be.
Wow, quite hefty stuff. Lorenzo, if you want to add to this, what do you work on exactly the same area that Celine works on?
Thanks for the question. I work on a similar area, I would say. So I'm an expert on systems and sustainability assessment, which means looking at environmental themes and sustainability themes from the perspective of their interconnections. So from their recognizing their systemic nature. And these necessitates very often the use of foresight techniques to support the identification of these connections and the reflection on what these interconnections means over different time scales and time frames. So and we try, in particular in my work, to make sense of this complexity between different components, right? In the context of integrated assessments like the state and outlook of the European environment, for example, or other assessments.
So, I mean, this is a huge area. This, as you mentioned, is complex. So what kind of change are we talking about here when we're talking changing to sustainability? Who would like to?
Yeah, I can comment on that, because we have recently, well, actually last year, published a report called Drivers of Change and Their Implications for the Environment and Sustainability in Europe. And well, what we meant by then with drivers of change is fundamentally a variety of phenomena that can impact on our state of the environment and beyond in our society in Europe. And therefore, they can be looked across those categories that Celine was mentioning. So they can be of demographic nature, they can be of a technological and innovation nature, they can have more to do with the political, social, political, and economic change that we're witnessing in the world, and therefore they can have very, very different impacts on how Europe can respond, and particularly on how Europe can decide to invest against such fundamental modifications. I think one particular example that unfortunately we are all witnessing is the COVID crisis, in a sense. That is it is definitely a factor of change which has affected lives across the globe. And yeah, so these type of fundamental changes are the ones we're looking at in order to boost anticipatory thinking and preparedness against these crises.
So are you sort of like mapping theoretical hypothetical situations and where getting from point A to point B to sustainability? Are we doing that sort of specific mapping type thing?
I think that's an element of that. So we have an activity which is called trend analysis. So it's a combination of trying to understand the past and read through the past in the attempt to understand which scenarios could potentially manifest in the future, I think. Yeah, so the work that was published last year was attempting to do that. So, but it's always a combination of the two. We cannot interpret the future. I mean, we cannot make some claims potentially about the future if we do not understand where we come from. And for instance, it's also the COVID-19 crisis was not entirely a surprise in a sense. So it was in terms of its impacts, but the mechanisms were potentially known, for instance.
Okay, yeah, because Celine, I was just going to ask you, to what extent do we already know what spanner in the works the COVID-19 pandemic has put towards our planning towards sustainability?
Sorry, can you repeat that? I didn't get.
To what sense has the pandemic altered our paths to change already?
Okay, I think in a way it has put a light on the concept of resilience more strongly. So now we talk much more about how societies are being prepared or preparing themselves to this kind of very impactful and sudden changes, because that's one that we feel the impact we felt the impact from one day to the next. So that's this idea about but there are also changes that are much slower, like if we think about social media. So that's also a change. So yeah, it's also differentiating potentially between how fast they might happen and how could we prepare for them to some extent.
Yeah, interesting. Lorenzo, if I could turn to you a bit more about the drivers of change means in terms of Europe's sustainability goals.
Yeah, well, as I was mentioning before, drivers of change, it's a plethora of phenomena fundamentally. No? So they can be of a long-term nature. So they can be, they are called typically global megatrends. So they act at a global scale and they're somehow in the mid to long-term difficult to reverse and very pertinent, very permanent. So that this is typically the issue of population growth, and although lately these days, but particularly population aging and things of the sort. And then there are other forms of change, which as Celine was mentioning, are happening at a very shorter scale. And what we tried to do in our assessment was to combine these elements, discuss the interactions that occur between them over scale and across themes, and reflect on their potential impact for sustainability in Europe. I can make a couple of examples just to get it more tangible. For instance, we know that Europe has ambitions in relation to decarbonization, and obviously, the switch towards renewable energies depends a lot on critical raw materials that are not necessarily sourced within Europe, or typically are not sourced within Europe. Therefore, it is very important to think of trade and of concentration of power of these resources across the globe when thinking of strategies which can allow Europe to achieve its goals. So that's a very practical example in a sense. Yeah. And
we've already talked to sort of Celine, to you a bit about trends with the COVID-19 trend or whatever, how it's altered trends. What other trends should we be aware of in this debate?
I think that in terms of trend, we have the the technological ones are often presented purely on the technological aspects, but they can have, so I think, for example, about drones, we sometimes talk about drone deliveries, or the automated cars and connected vehicles. And so those are trends that we often discuss. And so what we do there is to reflect on them already, what can be their implications on social aspects, environmental aspects, before they become really global. So that's a bit the otherwise, in terms of trends, there are really a lot. It's hard to do a list there. There are some short trends that for example, linked to home working. So that's a trend that has appeared very quickly. Some
which we've seen a reduction of emissions during the crisis. Yeah.
Yes. So yeah, depending on what time scale you're looking at, there's really I don't know if Lorenzo has some in mind that he wishes to share some very impactful trends.
Well, their impact sometimes is difficult to know in advance. So that's why we have these activities which tend to scan the horizon. They're actually called horizon scanning, for identifying them and making sense of them. That's the whole point of Foresight, in a sense, of studying what could be the potential implication. Would they stay at the level of the niche innovations, or would they become a substitute of our current configurations of production and consumption? So that's typically a matter of deliberation and engagement with experts and so on. And we recently published 4 briefings on emerging trends. One was about artificial meat, one about synthetic biology, another on blockchains, and and these technologies fundamentally raise challenges and opportunities at the same time, I would say. And being aware of that for the legislators, but also in general for the environmental community is very important, because we can have and studying them, of course, because we can have a much more informed decision base.
Indeed. And I guess people will probably mention, electric vehicles or the digitalization, as you mentioned, working from home. I guess those are longer term trends, but I guess electric vehicles fall in, the decarbonization trend, getting rid of combustible engine motors and so forth. Again, to our viewers, if you have any questions or comments, please post them down and we'll make sure our experts see them and answer them for you. I have one question ready from Sultan Mohammed Razak. How can you connect culture and environment and sustainability? Who would like to touch on that one?
I guess if I may, I would say that it's by staying really up to date and staying connected and trying to highlight, to identify signals when they appear, and beside a signal or a piece of information, but trying to see what the ramifications are and what the causes are, and by doing that on a daily basis, but most importantly through Foresight projects, we get people from different, so the basics, the practical aspect of Foresight project is to get people from different backgrounds, to get them in the project and to ask them questions and get their views. And so if you want to link environment and culture, that you would need people that have links with some given cultures and environment, and then start a conversation. So these are obviously very large topics, but when we have a project, we start with a more specific point and expand. So the idea is you start with a specific focus, you really expand and get a lot of different people with backgrounds and different specialization and views involved, and they can express themselves. And then we work with these different views and signals and informations, and shape that into a more compact output.
Mm-hmm. And I guess talk about culture. I mean, of course, we work for the EU as a whole, and for the EEA community as a whole, so beyond EU member states. Do you see a difference in cultures in approaching sustainability, behaviors, human behavior? Obviously, behavior will become an important factor in switching to a just transition.
Um, I wouldn't say a difference in culture. That's a bit. It's more for social experts to answer.
Okay.
But I think from the Foresight point of view, I see a general curiosity, and I think everybody from whatever culture we are part of, we can see that there is really this hyper connectivity and technological developments and impact environment which impacts ourselves, and so that's a cycle like that, and I think everybody can feel that, and is really showing interest for this approach that is a bit more forward looking, so that's really interesting.
It's just to follow up on that, because during the crisis, the pandemic, we saw behaviors change. We saw people heading out to green spaces, to forests and so forth. What impacts can that have? Is that a lasting impact, that people respect nature more and that they're willing to do their part? Or we've also saw an increase in single-use plastics use, so maybe they balance out. I don't know. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I wish I could answer, but that's, that's not the realm of my possibilities. But that's precisely what this kind of project or Foresight approach would do, is you see the positive aspects, and of course it's nice to notice. But then it's also to have the other look at what is maybe not so positive, and then put these in the balance and see from there.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll touch back on this in a year's time, and perhaps we'll see even more impact. But let me just get to more of another report we recently published, Growth Without Economic Growth. Lorenzo, if you could tell a little bit about that report, which caused a little bit of a stir online, a lot of discussion and debate.
Yeah, indeed. Well, that briefing belongs to a series called Narratives for Change, which has specifically the aim of presenting alternative or complementary, sometimes new, sometimes less new perspectives on certain topics of actual relevance for sustainability in Europe and beyond. In particular, this one was dedicated to the concept of growing in a way which is not necessarily economic growth, and has fundamentally been pointing to an issue associated to our structure of production and consumption, according to which the more we grow in terms of economy, so our GDP grows, well, it also increases very much, in many cases, environmental pressures and impacts, right? And so we have reflected on the fact that these absolute decoupling of the pace and scale that is necessary to meet Europe's ambitions in relation to the environment and sustainability has not been materializing to the space, to the scale and pace we would like to see, and therefore it's pointing to perhaps the necessity of rethinking what is actually the necessary framing of this issue. So shouldn't we switch from a consumerist society towards a society that is more attentive to the environment, but also spending, let's say, less time in producing and consuming, but more on social relations, for instance, and therefore move away from this idea of the imperative of growth towards strategies like sufficiency or a reduction in material consumption, which could perhaps be an important turning point towards the way for achieving durable, sustainable Europe, actually. So indeed, it has stirred some debate, because it's something which is not controversial, which is obviously controversial. It's not free of controversies, indeed. But that was exactly the point. Let's discuss about it. Let's try to reframe, because we think that's an important leverage point for the change we want to achieve, and more, let's say, and solutions which focus only on technological change and marginal technological change so far have been shown little results in comparison to the scale of our ambition.
For instance, the combustion engine making it more efficient doesn't change the bigger problem, does it?
That's the thing. Efficiency, if it is taken as a strategy per se alone, it might well lead to the issue of rebounding, so expanding consumption overall, because costs are lowered, and therefore, instead of having an overall reduction, we can witness an overall increase. So efficiency per se and taken alone is not the solution. It has come with other changes, which are typically not in the technological sphere. Not only, they're more on the social innovation dimension, and therefore different narratives are necessary to circulate for that.
Okay, I don't know, Celine, if you had something to add, but before you do, just remind our viewers that if you have a question or comment, you can get them in now, and we'll make sure that our experts answer them. Did you have anything to add on that, Celine?
No, about the work, Lorenzo's work on the growth without economic growth. I think that really displays where foresight and system thinking is important, and it's interesting because it gives the space to explore these scenarios that are not necessarily explored so much due to the current paradigms, economical, sociological, and so I think that's really where foresight is interesting, to have that space and be able to inform back in like policy decision makers how things might evolve if they don't go as we have exactly planned.
Okay, I have some questions on that, but before I do, I'll go to a question from one of our viewers from Eleftheria. Doesn't sustainability require a much faster and drastic transformation? What kind of trends do we need? Is that realistic given how slow we change? That's, I wanted to get to, how realistic is all this?
I am happy to respond to this one. I think it is as realistic as we make it, in a sense, because we are actors of that change, and therefore it's not necessarily a given if we do not really commit seriously to these goals. On the other hand, there is a risk of let's say selecting suboptimal solutions, so-called solutions, which might look solutions for the problems that we face, but they have only a limited ability to respond to these challenges. And that's exactly why we wanted to broaden the debate towards the different narratives that are necessary, perhaps, and perspectives that could be embraced for making these change happen.
Okay, yeah, because for instance, I mean, moving to a circular economy, a lot of people question, well, how can we go completely circular? Is that even realistic? Just an example. I mean, is that what we're striving for, 100% circular economy?
Well, unfortunately, 100% circular economy, it is not possible in thermodynamic terms, because once that's at the core of it, in a sense, because once energy is consumed and energy carrier is used, then energy is dissipated. That cannot be recycled. So that's not 100% for sure. And once we use the food for feeding our bodies, that's also dissipated in a way. So it cannot be fully recycled. So there are some limits, theoretical limits to what it can be achieved in terms of circularity of the material flow. Yet the principle for which we should slow down the pace of this linear consumption and production trend, which is just driving us towards more and more unsustainable situations, it's very important. And also the policy actions that are taken under that umbrella are fundamental and fundamentally helping in achieving some of these goals. But of course, it is important to acknowledge also the both opportunities and risks that arise with narratives.
Okay, so we're doing all this work, all these reports. Can you just, in a practical sense, Celine, perhaps tell me what happens to our reports and works here? How is this carried forward? Yeah,
so we have had some work on foresight for quite a few years, for example, on global megatrends. And then these identified global megatrends can be used in other assessment. For example, there's been some analysis at national level based on these global megatrends. And then the assessment is used as part of the state of the environment reporting. So it allows us to feed and give a more forward-looking with outlooks as part of the state of the environment. So the idea is to, of course, we have the very concrete work that the EEA does on the current air pollution and energy and this type of data. And so the idea is to develop more the forward-looking aspect to give this type of indication. So that's what we're planning. We're doing at the moment is developing this foresight aspect based on what has been done and on Lorenzo's work, and develop their implementation within the current EEA work and the assessment that are already being conducted. So we would like to see foresight as a systematic approach that brings a complement to the more quantitative and scientific work there.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose this is you inform policymakers across Europe with these reports as well.
We have some projects where we work in collaboration with DG Environment, DG RTD, and we also work sometimes with the Foresight team at the OECD, also at the JRC. And we have a network with IONET, so the network of member and collaborating countries. And so we work with NRC FLIS, some international network of Foresight practitioners.
That was my next question. To what extent are other international bodies working in this area? I assume a lot, like UN or other bodies are, and to what extent do we cooperate with them? Is everybody seeing the same type of, are we all headed towards the same direction, or do you see other paths, interesting paths in Asia or?
Yeah, I think depending, of course, on the geographical location that has a more particular focus, but we also, foresight is only useful when it's a participatory project process, and we can inform each other because we are, of course, impacted by what happens in Asia, obviously, and the other way around. So it's also about developing networks and collaborations, because you can't do foresight on your own. That's not really a thing. And then yes, and we also work now. The EU has a vice president for foresight, Maros Šefčovič. So there is some work on foresight that's being done at the EU Commission and with the JRC. So we also collaborate to some extent to this.
And how will the work at the EEA evolve in this area? I guess I can ask both of you that.
We're developing some different projects with the different areas of study that we have at the EEA, and so it's about finding the right way to bring in foresight to really complement the work that's done already. So we're working on that.
I have a question from Todd. What about the global dimension of sustainability? Economic growth is needed for meeting basic needs for many people in the world.
Yeah, thanks for the question. That's something obviously very often raised. And I think you can imagine two different strategies across the globe. So redistribution is the key word there, because if developed countries could probably look at sufficiency and a steady state economy, or even post-growth economic strategies. For developing countries, indeed, there's a necessity to increase access to services, to basic services. But the combination of the two does not necessarily have to lead to an increased economic growth at the global scale. So that's an important point. So redistribution would be a key to not necessarily not in order not to grow necessarily as a globe, but to reduce inequalities in a sense, and also reducing the environmental pressure.
Okay, we have a comment from Anna Louise. Quantitative methods should be considered. Are they?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I should say that with foresight, because we're looking forward towards the future and potential development. So there's obviously a lot of qualitative work that is done there, qualitative data, but that obviously cannot replace quantitative work. It comes, that's what I was mentioning, it comes as a complement, as an opening, and bringing some potential alternative views, but we will never replace the quantitative work that's done. No.
I'd like to add something on this. I think that sometimes the differentiation between the two, the dichotomy, is a bit false, right? In the sense that in the majority of the quantitative methods that we use, so integrated assessment models and so on, there are a very large number of assumptions that are fundamentally of a qualitative nature, right?
Yeah.
So it is not so straightforward to distinguish between the two, and sometimes just because a model leads to a number, it is assumed to be more robust than a well-informed process that builds on collective intelligence about scoping what potential impact a certain development can have. So I think it's important also collectively as a society, as the entity at the boundary between science and policy, to consider carefully these issues to provide better information into the policy-making processes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a quick follow-up from Anne-Louise. What do you mean by growth, as Lorenzo already said? Lorenzo, you're on the hot seat.
Yeah, I can see. I mean, growth without economic growth, the title of the briefing was precisely alluding to the fact that we can grow in terms of values, in terms of cherishing different perspectives about life that are not necessarily building on a materialistic lifestyle. So we can have more free time to spend with our loved ones. We can really rethink what we mean in terms of with growth by taking inspiration from alternative perspectives of this sort, rather than just the focus on the material growth. I think that's where we wanted to create a bit of tension, and I think we succeeded in that.
Yeah, definitely. Another question from Sultan. Policy should be global and implementation need globally. In that case, what's the EEA's present action? So again, it comes down to how wide is our foresight?
I think for Foresight, at least at the EU level, is now there is a clear effort to implement it more directly into policy mechanisms, policy processes. So that's where we are now. But yeah, I work at the EEA level, so I can't say exactly for the European Commission.
Maybe can add.
Yeah,
sorry,
go ahead.
Yeah, just that, of course, the EEA is involved in many of the international negotiations and activities, which is not the field we are necessarily working on. I mean, Celine and myself, but I agree on the fact that environmental and sustainability challenges have a global dimension, and the agency is active in supporting the Commission in such negotiations. Yeah, just wanted to point out to that.
Thanks. 2 quick fire rounds before we wrap up, as our time is running out. One more from Sultan. How we involve civil society in collaborative programs, and another one from Nicola Vallat. Are you working on constituting a special commission on post-growth futures in the EU Parliament? I don't think we are, but who wants to tackle these last 2 questions?
I can take the first one about involving society. There are different ways of getting citizens involved. That depends on the topic. Of course, now we like to explore some now with social media and get direct feedback, but that also requires who to involve and what scale, so that it's more the technical aspects, and but that's definitely a consideration. And Foresight is really interesting when you can get different age and different backgrounds, and so that's something always that I have on my mind, that to have this inclusion of citizens. And so yeah, and I think about it.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you to our experts, Lorenzo and Celine. It definitely brought me back to my political science university days with research methods. But I'm sure we'll definitely come back to this subject because there's a lot of interesting stuff here to go over. Thanks again for joining us, and I hope you join us again soon for our next edition.